Welcome to RESGEN's Giving Life Podcast. Stories and conversations about life in Christ, everyday discipleship, exploring ways that we as men can give life to others. My name is Tom Henderson, the founder of RESGEN, and I'm really glad that you're joining me today. Now, this episode is a little different than the other ones because while it can stand on its own, it's also kind of a continuation or a part two of our last episode where my guests were Nate and Maggie Blaylock. On that episode, which I hope you'll go back and listen to if you haven't done so already, Nate and Maggie shared their powerful story about how God restored their marriage. A marriage that was on the brink of being torn apart after Maggie found out about the secret life that Nate was living. Well, after hearing their story, I asked Nate, who is now a certified life and recovery coach, to come back so that he and I could talk a little more specifically about the impact that pornography is having on our marriages, on our kids, and on our culture as a whole. And also, so we could talk about some steps that individuals can take if they are struggling with getting free from this destructive issue that no one really wants to talk about. I'm super thankful you're joining me today for this very important conversation with Nate Blaylock. Nate Blaylock, welcome back to the RESGEN Giving Life Podcast.
Thank you. Really glad to still be back here.
Yeah, you know, because obviously the last time you were here, last episode, we were with both you and Maggie, where we got to hear your story and just the incredible grace of both a Savior and a wife and two people leaning into the work that was required to be a part of God's restorative process in your guys' lives individually as well as collectively. And so I know that I'm hoping that our listeners to this episode will maybe go back if they hadn't already heard that one to be able to hear that in its entirety. But real quick before we get into this topic today that really a lot of people don't want to talk about. And I'm so appreciative that you're willing to have this conversation with me. But before we get into the topic, just give us a real quick snapshot, 30,000 feet view of your story that kind of led us to where you're at today.
Yeah. I mean, this topic of pornography is one that, it can be a little difficult to talk about, and it certainly created a massive detrimental impact in my life. And from just, being a pastor's kid in a church where this wasn't really talked about and some of my views around it were formed there, but it was just something that I, in my journey, struggled with and continually came back to. Maybe have long periods where it'd be like, I'm good, but I would just find myself keep coming back. And pornography got a hold of my life. And, it continued to grow. And eventually for me and my story, pornography wasn't enough. And I found myself looking for that hit or that pleasure wherever I could find it. Found myself leaving my marriage, just affairs, having this whole secret life that is really tough to talk about. And it's been easier over time. Mm-hmm. And it created detriment to my marriage and my family and just blew things up is the very easy way to put it. Mm-hmm. And sent me on a process to really face this has a bigger hold and has a potential bigger impact than I ever thought it would, this topic of pornography. And began my own journey of health toward it. And, fast forward almost 10 years later, a marriage that by the grace of God has been restored, mm-hmm. and a family that has been restored. And even further than that, creating a ministry out of this. And my wife is a certified sexual addiction therapist now, mm-hmm. one of just a couple in the state here in South Dakota. And we launched a private practice. I'm a certified life and recovery coach. And this is one of the topics that we love working with people on because mm-hmm. it's a topic that can really have a lot of impact on marriages, on relationships, on individuals. And so this is one of the things that we really focus on through our counseling and coaching, one of the topics, as well as anxiety and fear, all those other things, intimacy work and couples and marriages.
Yeah. That's and there's so much good that took place in the last episode. So much good conversation. And so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode yet, I can't encourage you enough to go back just one episode and listen to Nate and Maggie and I discuss their story and so much about their journey, a journey that did take a lot of work and took you from how you described it as the darkest time of your life And, that Maggie would say one of the darkest, if not the darkest time of her
sure.
life as well, for sure. But that God restored that. And what the enemy came to do is to destroy us, right? I mean, John 10:10 says that the enemy comes to rob, to steal, and to destroy us. And what he meant for destruction, God brought life to. And that was something else that came out of the last episode of, the Lord, he's in the resurrection business.
Amen.
And, obviously we have salvation because of Jesus defeating death, being raised from the dead. And God, through his power and his power alone, and your willingness to lean into the work and work with the Lord and with each other and therapy and all this other stuff, he brought life to a marriage that was dead.
Yeah, isn't that amazing how he works? I mean, and all of our stories have that component to it, right? Big, little, small, huge, the big areas, the little areas. That's what the God we serve is in the business of. And I've seen it firsthand in my life, breathe life into something that, a relationship, my own life that I just felt was dead, wasted, gone, into something that could be used for good. And that blows my mind to even say that, to even be sitting here and say that and see it lived out day to day. I'm just so thankful for God, his grace, the way he works, and the fact that no matter where we are, no matter where we find ourselves, maybe a point where you've said, like, I never thought that I would go here, and you found yourself there. There's hope. And I love that we serve a God that breathes life into what's dead.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Amen. Amen. All right. Well, we're going to dig right into it today, brother. Okay. We're going to go a little deep on this. And I know that this may not be a topic that most people are comfortable in talking about. And, this isn't like it's the best. We're not going to go talk over coffee, most of the time about the topic of pornography and just its impact on not just our culture, okay, but on individuals. Okay, it's easy to say, okay, this is a cultural thing, but but in a culture, it's made up of countless individuals and relationships, and the impact that pornography is having on individuals and relationships is staggering.
Right.
And the word pandemic has been thrown around and used a lot over the last year and a half with COVID, right? I mean, and rightfully so. It was something that shut our country down for a time. It took lives. It wreaked all sorts of havoc. But yet, pornography brings people down every day. Pornography is killing marriages left and right and is causing more pain and heartache, both by the consumer, those that are consuming it, and those that are trapped up in the business of it. It's doing that every day. But yet, that's not necessarily considered a pandemic, or we don't talk about it in that way.
That's right.
But yet I would say, and I'm sure you would agree with this, Nate, is that it is a pandemic of epic proportions in our culture.
Yeah, I don't think pandemic's an understatement in any way, shape, or form. And I don't think we're talking about it enough. I think the impacts are growing exponentially. I mean, I look at the impacts of guys, our generation and our age, and the detrimental impacts, and yet access, exposure, technology exponentially has grown, right, since our day. And it hurts my heart to think about just my kids and the generations that are coming after us and what they have not even begun to face yet, but absolutely will face because of this. It's huge.
Yeah, and it used to be that you would have to, I remember the first time I saw it was 13, 14 years old, walking home from my middle school. And, I was raised by my mom, 2 sisters, just consistently walked to school, walked home from school, went to a buddy's house on my way home to my house. I was going to go home to an empty home like usual because my mom was working, stopped there. And, of course, parents weren't there.
Yeah.
And he pulls out some magazines that he'd gotten from a gas station that he had hidden behind his bed. And I'm like, what in the world is this? And it was some pretty intense stuff. I don't know where he got these magazines, but it was and that was my first introduction to it. Yeah. And that was where you had to go, was like the magazines, or you had to try to watch, Showtime or HBO, at night, with the snowed out, it snowed, and you're like, hey, I think I just saw something. Yeah, exactly. And so you had to try so hard, it seemed like, to find it. or if you go to a hotel and maybe there'd be like a pay-per-view type thing. Now, I mean, it's you carry it around in your pocket every single day. Right. And so real quick, Nate, just give us some, like, beings that this is you and your wife are working with people all the time and you study this a lot. Yeah. And, I've been in youth ministry for over 20 years and now working specifically with men for like the last 4 and 5 years with the summit and discipleship stuff and all of that. But you have an expertise in this. I have kind of an overview. I have some things but you have some expertise that I think would be really good for us to know. And that's specifically in just some of the statistics, and then the impact that pornography is having on individuals, like our brains. Yeah. And then how is that impacting our relationship? So maybe start with some stats and
Yeah. I mean, one of the stats to me that's the most staggering just in this day and age that we live in is that pornography has more internet traffic than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. Right. So, I mean, you just take that one statistic and try to process that. Like, I think about Netflix. I mean, how much traffic is just on Netflix alone? Amazon. Lots of boxes show up in our house almost daily. Right. Twitter, but yet pornography, just the traffic is more than those three combined. I mean, just that one statistic is mind blowing. I mean, 68% of men in the church, right? Where you'd say, hey, this is an area where most people shouldn't struggle, or that's at least the perception, right?
Yeah, right.
Not reality, but would say that they've struggled with porn. I mean, the average annual revenue of the pornography industry, where, mind you, most of it is free, and most of the access to it is free today, which speaks to what you said earlier about just the access is unparalleled from what we've seen in the past. But the average annual revenue is greater than the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL combined. I mean, mind-blowing statistics here.
Yeah, seriously.
The average age of first exposure of pornography is 8 years old, between 8 and 9 years old.
And that's getting younger, because I remember when I was in like youth pastoring, it was, back when it was dial-up and all this, it was like, okay, it was in the upper teen years. Absolutely. And then when smartphones came out, then all of a sudden it got lowered to like 10 and 11, and now we're at 8.
Yep. And I mean, screens, right? Screens are everywhere. I mean, my youngest is 5, right? And he is a master on screens, right? And it's not a matter of, right, if my kids or if young kids will get exposed to it. It's a matter of when and how early. And 8 or 9, 10, the conversations around it are almost too late at that point, right? Because we need to name it. We need to call it. We need to talk about it. So those are just some of the statistics that would absolutely back up the fact that this is a pandemic, right? And I think anybody who hears that is like, man, this is such a big thing that's out there.
So real quick, and I'm going to interrupt you real quick if that's okay, and just ask the question, what is porn? Yeah. Because, you throw out stats like that, and I think and you hear the word porn, and we all can kind of define that differently. Yeah. And so, as with anything, it's helpful when we have a shared definition. Absolutely. So that some understanding can take place. So, what is porn?
Yeah. I mean, one of the most common definitions that, we use as we're talking about it clinically or with clients or whatever is just pictures, images, videos of people with little to no clothes on or performing sexual acts, right? I mean, that's kind of like your typical basic clinical definition. Now, the little clothes thing, right? I mean, that opens up a whole new genre. I mean, you talk social media. I mean, that it's unbelievable, just all the things that are out there and what is really almost normalized in our society today.
Yeah, like the used to be the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. So some people say, well, that's not porn. Yeah. That's just admiring God's beautiful creation,
or is it?
Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, and so then, and some would say, well, no, pornography is the sexual act but that's where your definition is, I think, so good, because it really it's broad enough, because I think we think about it in the wrong way. We think of it as okay, it's just this one thing, but what it's doing, and this is what we're going to get to here next, is what that image, video, whatever it is doing to our brains.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. the brain scans around pornography that show what happens whenever seeing pornography, naked images, what happens to the brain when that happens is the same. It lights up the same area and in the same way and to the same degree as crack cocaine lights up the brain. And, that's something that is almost, well, that's hard to hear for a lot of people or maybe strange to hear. But in some ways, I want to take the pressure off of anybody listening to this who maybe like instantly is like, has some shame around this topic. Like, I've struggled or whatever. I've wanted to not look at it and I still do. There's some science behind it, right? So this isn't just like a try harder topic or like, if you're a good enough guy, right, you're not going to deal with this. I mean, there's science behind the fact that the dopamine rush and the pathways that light up in our brain as we view or see pornography there's a really strong hold in the same way that I don't think anybody listening would be like, yeah, I don't think crack cocaine, that doesn't seem addictive to me. Yeah, I mean, I think we'd all agree, right? That's super addictive. And so what the one of the interesting things that happens with dopamine, and it can happen with anything that lights up your brain with dopamine, is you find yourself, here's the science behind it, needing more dopamine hits to feel the same level of normal.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what happens in addiction, period. So you talk about drug addiction, alcohol addiction, right? Just take alcohol, right? You take your first alcoholic drink, you're probably feeling something pretty intense at that point, right?
Right.
But years
halfway through your first beer, you're like, man, I'm
this is nuts.
Yeah.
Years down the road, right? You may be able to have a couple drinks without feeling anything. There's a tolerance that's built up, and that's a chemical thing. But there's a chemical component to what's happening in our brain around dopamine, serotonin that are released related to pornography. And so, I talked a little bit on the last episode, and this is a topic that pornography, when kept in the dark or unreally treated or talked about, or really we're unable to get to the root of why we do it and do some work around that, it progresses. And it almost always progresses. And it can progress in the types of pornography that we look at. It's like the same thing that hit yesterday is not given that same hit today. And that's the slippery slope. And the brain can become very like numb to some of those dopamine hits. And so it's like, porn, I believe porn's a pacifier, right? And so I want to introduce that topic here because I think that's something we feel good when we see anything that releases dopamine. Like when we get that dopamine hit, I mean, it can be good dopamine hits from food, working out, all of those things, right? That feels good. And what can happen is if we're not aware of some of the negative reasons why we run to those dopamine hits, then we find ourselves chasing that dopamine hit to feel normal or to regulate some of the fear, worry, anxiety, some of those negative things that we all feel, we all deal with. And so I like to say porn's a pacifier because there's usually something else going on. And it's like a deadly combination. It's like we're unaware of some of those things or we're not in touch with them, of what we're feeling. Then we can just chase this dopamine hit that then we need more of to feel the same way. And then it's just this path that becomes slippery and typically always progresses. And so that's one of just the scientific dangers around pornography and how the brain works that, a lot of our listeners may not be aware of. And I certainly wasn't aware of this topic in any way, shape, or form before I had my own experience and really working to get healthy.
Right. And I remember this was, I want to say maybe last year, or I don't recall the timing, but I remember when there was the comedian Chris Rock, when he was put out a Netflix stand-up special. And I remember seeing something come across socials or whatever where he talked about his struggle with pornography, and it got to the point where, he turned it obviously into some sort of stand-up joke or whatever, but it was I went and found that one section and just watched it where he talked about how it's like, in order for him to even get an erection or for him to feel any kind of sexual gratification or release, he said, it had to be like a zebra's body and a woman's face, and and he took it to a whole nother joking level, but he talked about just how he was out of control. And this is a stand-up comedian that, you and I grew up with, right? And then it was Marty, right? He's Marty. But that talked about how porn destroyed his marriage. And I thought, what an amazing, it's obviously crazy sad, but what an amazing amount of honesty from someone that could maybe speak into the lives of someone that you and I can't.
Right. I mean, and that's a great way to look at this, and that's a great example of what can and does happen to the brain. I mean, it literally, something that we go back to over time that gives us a dopamine hit can quite literally rewire our brain. And in that rewiring our brain can make us think that we need something to even, again, we talked about maintaining that level of normalcy, or at least chemically what's going on in the brain. But it can have some major detrimental, it does have major detrimental impacts to our physical self. And we can talk about that, our relationships and what it does, and it has the potential to do to our relationships. I mean, it's staggering.
So Nate, as you're talking, it just causes me to think, especially like for young guys. I remember like when I first started driving.
Yeah.
You know, I first started driving and I'm speeding. I'm like, well, I'll never get in a wreck. I'll never get picked up speeding, right? That's not going to happen to me. I'll never get hurt doing this one thing, and because it's never going to happen to me.
Right.
So I'm thinking about, and the stuff that we're saying is, oh, well, you know, it's not going to really build to that level with me.
Yeah.
It's not going to ever get to the level where, you know, I got to find just freaky stuff, or I got to go have an affair.
Right.
Or, you know, like, so what would you say to someone, because I'm assuming that was something that you said.
Like 100 times, more like 1,000,000 times.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thought. I mean, there's rationalization and justification there, but like as a guy, I grew up in the church, you know, my dad was a pastor. You know, I accepted the Lord at a young age, and I really wanted to do the right thing. I mean, so there was truth to that for me, of just like, I want to do the right thing, and it's only a little bit, and I'll never go to this level. But again, we can tell ourselves that story, but if there's some science going on behind the scenes that we're not in touch with, and then as things happen in our lives, that, you know, if that becomes our coping mechanism with tough stuff that happens in life, as tough stuff happens, we continue to cope. And I've seen so many stories, including my own, of guys sitting in my office or across a Zoom call just saying like, hey, I don't know what happened. I never thought it would get here. And I woke up one day and like I'd thrown my whole life away. Or I woke up one day, just found myself at a place I never, ever, ever, I swore I would never be. And that is what pornography does.
Yeah, it's really, it takes the question of, well, how far is too far? You and I were talking a little bit about that earlier.
Yeah.
Like, especially like in a dating relationship, a lot of times that's one of the big questions that I always got as a youth pastor from my teenagers that were dating, is they're like, well, how far is too far? Like,
Right.
I mean, you know, to where it's not sex and it's okay. And so then we talked about, okay, so, you know, what's the motivation? What's all this? And so, but in this, and what is just going to, you know, hand holding all of a sudden doesn't get you the butterflies anymore.
Right.
Like first time you hold, you know, your girlfriend's hand or whatever in the movie, and you're like sweating, you're like, this is the most amazing thing ever. And then the next time it's just commonplace.
Right.
Right. And so it consists of, well, what's the boundary you're going to put in place so that it doesn't create this desire for, well, now I got to get this, now I got to do this in that relationship. Well, understanding that how this can grab a hold, and I think the way that you said it in the front end of our time together here today was that it like really sunk its teeth into you.
Yeah.
So it's not a question of how far is too far, how much is too much. It's recognizing that any amount can give the opportunity for it to sink its teeth into you.
Yeah.
And grow from there.
That's right. I mean, I love what you said, because I think the idea of like, where's the line, or how much is too much? I mean, I think that's probably a lie from the enemy, right? That you can handle a little bit of this, or a little bit of this is normal. But the reality is, like, if you're even trying to find or creeping up near whatever that line would even be, like, you're done. I mean, the idea is biblically, right, is to flee from sexual immorality.
Right, yeah.
To run the other direction from it, to not let it have any common place And so there may be, we can talk about some of the accountability components of that and what that means. But I think this idea of just a little bit, or, I like looking at this social media Instagram page, but, I don't really do porn, right? That is and can be very detrimental, because are you fleeing from all sexual immorality? And when we look at it from that perspective, I feel like it kind of can flip and expose really some of the justification, the lies that are going on from the world, from the enemy, from our hearts, that are scary to think about, for sure.
Yeah. So what are you seeing, professionally, from kind of the downstream impacts of porn? Like in the conversations you're having with people of all ages, by the way, this is not a situation where it's just like college age dudes.
And let me also say, men and women, I mean, the statistics around pornography use in women are incredibly on the rise. And this isn't just something that just affects men. The statistics are higher for men. And I'm so glad we're having this conversation today, because it's needed. I think one of the reasons why it is such a topic that grabs hold and just hits differently is because there's so much shame around the topic. And we can talk about shame, but because we're not talking about it, there's so much shame. But I do want to, this isn't just a guy thing, right? We're talking primarily two guys here and about guys, but this can affect both for sure. From a brain perspective, let's just carry that thought through, and then I'll jump to some of these others. Pornography absolutely affects our sexual template. So, there's a lot of interesting research and studies out there that just show that, it's that same idea of like what was good yesterday wasn't enough, that like when we put these images or videos into our brain over and over, it can literally change our sexual template. And, one of the crazy downstream impacts that we're seeing clinically is this concept of pornography-induced erectile dysfunction, like very physical responses, like people like the being in a relationship, what should be healthy sex between a committed, husband and a wife. For somebody who's had a lot of porn use in their background, there can actually be like, I'm unable to perform here, which is just mind-blowing to think about. But that actually is a downstream impact from looking so much at images, and images, by the way, that are completely unrealistic and not the way God intended for sex in any way, shape, or form, can actually retemplate the brain. And it's like the brain thinks this is what it needs. So all of a sudden it's like in the flesh, a committed partner relationship, and like brain's like, I don't know what to do here. So we're seeing some physical responses to increased pornography use that are super scary in relationships. Just some of the relational components, and obviously that's a relational component, but the need for intimacy. We're wired for intimacy. Let's start there. God wired us to be people who need physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, right? Like, and I define intimacy as being fully known, fully loved, right? That is what we're wired for. And what this does is this, now we have places in our heart or our mind that are hidden. And so we're unable to receive, like, you can have an incredibly committed partner who's saying, I love all of you, right? But if there's an area, if this maybe porn or anything else is like a hidden topic and hasn't been talked about, this instant thought usually triggers, conscious or unconscious, like, yeah, but if you knew me, you wouldn't, right? If you really knew all of me. And that concept can just, I've seen it wreak havoc on relationships, because all of a sudden we're unable to receive love. It makes us selfish, and there's a component of sin that obviously it becomes self-centered and self-focused. And so again, there's physical components, there's spiritual components. Yeah. This separation from, sin at its root, it separates us from God, right? And that this is absolutely sin, and this absolutely has a spiritual component. But I think so many times in the church and other circles, it's like, but you should be like, just do better spiritually, right? And so that's why I love to talk and even lead with like the scientific part. Like this is way more than just pray harder, do better.
Yeah, pray it away.
Pray it away,
Read your Bible more.
That's right. And then the shame, right? The enemy uses that to, instead of just like, I made a mistake in this area, to like, you are a mistake in this area. Like, you can't get this right. Like, that's the message that I think the enemy uses here. And that shame of like, I keep going back and I can't get this right. And I think as men, oh man, it is leading us out of being who we're called to be spiritually, relationally, leading our families, right? Because this is one area that like, I can't get it. I can't get it right. It's just, and I've seen this one topic, even when completely unexposed, cause and wreak havoc on families, on potential. It's killing our potential as guys.
Well, and because it just continues to kill us from the inside.
That's right.
You know, and it is little by little just whittling away, and not allowing us, because Christ came to set us free. You know, but when we're living in a bondage to anything, it's hindering our ability to live free, be free, minister free, love free.
That's right.
I mean, it's hindering every aspect of our lives.
And this concept of bondage, right? I mean, what is bondage? Well, bondage is anything. I mean, we're in chains to anything that we continually going back to that can cause negative impacts to us, or that we want to stop. I mean, no shaming message on this.
Sure,
we're here to bust shame around this topic, right? We need to be talking about it. We need to be talking about it in our churches. We need to be talking about it in our marriages. We need to be talking about it in our small groups. We need to be talking about this topic. But, you know, I wonder how many guys are listening who hear that definition and can't say, well, yeah, I mean, pornography, that fits. You know, I know I shouldn't do it. I don't want to do it. But yet I found myself continually going back to it. Brother, you may be in bondage, you know, and to your point, the Lord wants to set us free. And there's nothing like that true freedom here, right? To like, search me and know me, my thoughts, search me and know all of me. And we're able to receive, I believe, the Lord's love in a much different way when this topic or another topic doesn't have this little tiny 1%. And that's the justification. It's just this little area, right? And it's not that big a deal. Nobody knows about it. But that 1% can keep us from receiving, you know, and being exactly who God's called us to be.
You saying that reminds me of something that that my pastor in Oregon, for those that are common, usual listeners of the Giving Life podcast, they know that I was a youth pastor for 6 years in Portland, Oregon, had a phenomenal pastor, mentor, just God knew exactly what I needed, you know, as a 23-year-old youth pastor. And I remember several messages that he spoke and a bunch of the encouragements that he gave me as a young dude. But one of the messages that I'll never forget was how he talked about in this area of freedom and what God did not come. He did not send Jesus to this earth and to the cross so that we could manage our sin.
Right.
He came and went to the cross and was resurrected from the dead to obliterate our sin, to separate our sin from us as far as the east is from the west, and so that we could experience freedom. But yet we think that we can just manage our sin, that we can control our sin. But what we realize, the longer we try to do that, we ain't in control at all. It's the sin that's controlling us.
That's right. And I love that. I love how you put that. And you know what we do whenever we pretend or we don't talk about something or we act like it's not that big a deal or we don't address it, a topic of sin like this. You know what we do? We cheapen the cross. We cheapen the cross because guess what? When God sent his son to die on the cross for all of our sins, he paid the price for all of it. And if we live our lives in such a way that's like, here's the 90%, but this 10%, like we're cheapening. God paid all of it, but yet we just hold on to this area. And I remember hearing that concept one time, and I'm like, oh my gosh, my whole life, I've not been accepting the full work of the cross because again, freedom is what we're after, and that is why he came. And when there's areas that we allow for bondage or we just don't want to deal with because it's hard, and or because you know we can't or we don't know how to get out of it, or we just don't want to talk about it, or churches aren't talking about it, we can really cheapen that work, and that's it's so devastating, you know.
Well, it just furthers the conversation of God wants all of us.
Yeah.
You know, we even the way that we look at money, right? I mean, so we give our tithe, we give our 10%, and then the rest of the 90% is mine.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's still the Lord's.
Right.
You know, we are to steward all of our money, but it's the Lord that owns it all. And the Lord wants all of us. He doesn't want just the parts that we want to give, the parts that we just are willing to. He wants it all. And that's even the same in our earthly relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Think about like in your marriage or in my marriage, if we say, okay, we'll give you just this portion of us.
Yeah.
And we're holding some back. That's not the definition of that sacrificial love that Jesus wants us to have for our spouse, where it's not 50-50, it's 100-100, right? And so it's so much. So we talk about like the impact that it has on relationships. It's may not be recognized, it may not be seen, it may not be realized, but it is having an impact. The other person may not know,
right?
But you know,
right?
You know, and the same thing goes in our relationship with God. But the thing is with God, He knows, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing that is hidden from the Lord. You know, and it's there. I can't remember which psalm it is, and where it just talks about He knows everything about us. He knows when we rise, and He knows when we lie down.
Yeah.
He knows literally everything there is to know about us, and He just is saying, "Where are you?" Like He said to Adam and Eve in the garden. Where are you guys? I know where you're at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know who else knows is the enemy knows, right? And the enemy does come to steal, kill, and destroy, as you said, and so masterful in this area.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's the greater sin, and this is, the Bible says that this sin is different. You know, this is a different sin. It's against our bodies, and there's something. Again, I feel like those hooks can go much deeper here, but that message around shame, again, is just such a killer in this space, and can prevent us from taking action or moving forward or wanting to take any steps here to want to get rid of this in our lives.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about the issues, and we've talked about, okay, this is what it's doing and all that, and so I want to talk a little bit about in a second with, okay, so what do we do about it? Okay, so I want to get there in a second, but I thought that there's something that you shared with me that I thought was really interesting that I was completely unaware of. But you told me that South Dakota actually declared this pornography a public health crisis in 2017.
Right.
Which that was not on the front page of the newspaper, I don't think. I mean, I don't know that was common knowledge that was thrown out on socials or whatever, but so South Dakota actually declared this pornography as a public health issue in 2017. What does that mean?
Well, yeah, I mean, and you're right. It wasn't really out there. And again, we work in this space and this industry, and it took some time for us to be like, what? I think South Dakota was the third state to do it. So I think it was like Utah and Virginia. I mean, so South Dakota in a lot of ways was on the cutting edge at admitting that. And in some of their research when it came out just said that this can cause danger, pornography and exposure to it can cause dangerous, and risky behaviors long term, which it absolutely does. It can cause self-esteem issues across relationships, eating disorders. I mean, it traces through a lot of these things to pornography being the root of it, right? And so to declare this like a public health crisis, and for the state that we live in, to say this is big enough that we're willing to dedicate additional funds, resources to help, because we see like the generations down the road, we need to educate. I mean, my wife on the last episode talked about the education. We did a great job in the 80s and 90s. If we grew up in that era, like DARE and like drug education was a thing. Like that was real.
Right.
And I think
we all remember the pan with the eggs, and this is your
brain
on drugs.
We all
Any
saw
questions?
It. Right. And the DARE shirts. I mean, we did a great job with drug education. And I think, as part of this, declaring this a pandemic, I think it's South Dakota realizing, along with these other states, that we've got to start dealing with this at a younger age, and maybe incorporating this into schools and other things for education, because education around pornography has to happen, because the same type of detrimental impacts we're seeing in society, dangers, physical, relational, all of those things. And so, yeah, because of that, again, there's so you can go look on the South Dakota website. There's resources, right, that can point to some resources out there to be able to find some free ways to get help. And I want to cover some of those resources here today too, which is really cool. I mean, I'm proud of our state for saying
for sure. That's what I was going to say.
Realizing that pornography in and of itself is a pandemic, right? It's a public health crisis, and as a result of that, we're starting to see things. I mean, in the mental health, the book for mental health is the simple way to put it. Just now getting to the point where they're recognizing this as like a diagnostic thing. So insurance billing and things like that can start to come through this space. And think about how many lives already we've heard about being damaged. And that's just now happening, right? And so I think we're just on the cutting edge as society to normalize this conversation and just say, I mean, outside of even the Christian part of this, let's take that out for a minute. Just public health crisis. This is a public health crisis. And that kind of puts a different spin and different thought process around this.
Right. And so let's talk about the vaccine. If we get about, not that vaccine, but then so how do we handle this? Okay, so this public health crisis, and it really happens with one person at a time, just owning it and saying, okay, you know what? It is something that's been a struggle for me. I've continually said this is the last time. I really don't want to do this. I've seen the way that's just leaving me in knots. Or what if someone is just, they're listening and they say, man, that's my struggle. That is my struggle. What do they do? Where do they start?
Yeah,
because I think that's a big question. Well, where do you start? It seems too big.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I can do it on my own.
Yeah, maybe it's too shameful. I can't tell anybody about this. Whatever. That's the first step. The first step is find somebody in your life that you can just have an authentic conversation about. Because again, we've seen the beautiful power of the Me Too movement over the last couple of years, right? In this country, and there's power in saying, yeah, you know what? You're not alone. Me too. And so, I mean, I would say that's the absolute first step, is just to find somebody trusted in your life, right? It can be maybe a pastor, it can be a friend, it can be somebody that just say, I'm willing to talk about this, right? So that's a good option. In some cases, you may say, I don't have anybody in my life, and I totally get that, find a professional, find somebody to start with, Obviously, we're advocates as professionals, right? At Known Counseling Services, my wife's a certified sexual addiction therapist. I'm a certified life and recovery coach. So there's coaching options around this that are very clinical. There's counseling options around this to go.
And confidential too.
Exactly. If you want to find a safe space, go take that step. Just go take that step and go talk to somebody. I love some other episodes that you've had on here have just talked about the power of mental health, even just period, right? And just finding a therapist or finding somebody we can just process some of the stuff that we can't see in our own lives and what's going on here.
Which again, and that's such a difficult hurdle sometimes for guys to jump over, because we just don't want to admit that we can't do it on our own, or that we don't have it all figured out, or that we need help, or that there's something wrong, or that we're not strong enough to handle it on our own. But again, this is something that has, it's proven that you haven't been able to do it on your own.
Totally.
And the finding a person to confide in, to hold you accountable, is a great first step. And maybe for some, that's, if it's a minor thing or whatever, okay, that can get you on a good road. And
totally.
So you're not minimizing that.
Right.
But yet at the same time, there's definite situations.
Totally.
And if you're in one of those where it's just kind of like, okay, it's repetitive, it's chronic, I can beat it, I can beat it.
Yeah. Have you tried to do accountability in the past and it hasn't worked? That's an indicator that take another step, go find somebody. We're huge advocates for certified sexual addiction therapists, because again, this is just different. This is just a different thing. It's not just like a compulsive thing. There's a component of that, right? But there's some very scientific things that happen related to just pornography use, masturbation, those types of things, and the hold that can have on us. So find a professional in this space. There's amazing resources online. And again, there's kind of that intermediate step. If you're unsure that you want to take that step, or that's a really scary step, go do some research online. Pure Desire, puredesire.org is one of just the best Christian resources out there related to this. They've got all kinds of free tools, resources, videos, those kinds of things out there. Pathformen.org, bloomforwomen.org. There's some secular resources, sex and relationship healing.com. There's great resources where you can read, educate yourself. There's assessments you can take to say, you know what, let me see where I fall on the scale. Maybe this is just a little bit, and maybe it wouldn't rise to the level where somebody would say like, yeah, this is addiction. You may need a further level of help. I mean, accountability may help nip this in the bud, but again, freedom is what we're after.
Right.
And so
not management.
Not management.
Not sin management.
That's right.
Not management, but yeah, freedom. And for those, and the websites that you mentioned there, I'll get all those from you.
Yeah.
We'll put those on the episode page, all those links, and then obviously a link to Known Counseling, and we'll touch on that towards the end of our time together here as well. But we want to make sure that we're able to remind people of those sites. And the best thing is, like you said, is that they're free.
Yeah, a ton of great free resources out there.
And that's the goal is understanding, education, and then say, okay, what do you do with that education? Right.
And you hit on something a minute ago about it's just, as guys, it's really hard for us. It's just hard for us. It's almost, I want to encourage, this may be a weird way to encourage, but one of the tragic things in this space is that statistics show that it's like upwards of high 90s, like 98%, very high 90% of people in general, but let's just say guys for the use of this conversation, don't seek any help on this topic unless they're caught, unless something happens where their life has become unmanageable or it affects their relationship, right? Or like been exposed by my wife, and now we have some relationship conflicts, and we have to go get help. So like, I want to encourage guys, like you just take the phrase, like, be a man, right? I mean, there's so many ways that we could view that, positive, negative, whatever. But like, if you want to lead, be the 2%. I mean, if you're hearing this, let that motivate you to say, like, most guys don't ever do anything with this until it's too late. How beautiful. I mean, I look at my story and I just have so much sadness and regret that I could have done so many different things differently. Like, I wish that I could have go back and took some steps and actions before it got out of control and before it devastated those around me in my life, and family and relationships. And you may be at a point where you've had a struggle with pornography and it hasn't affected your relationships in a big way. Praise God, right? That's amazing. And I want to encourage you, go take some steps now.
Yeah. So
you don't have to get to a point where you look back and we're like, it continued to progress. I didn't think it was that big a deal. Don't let that story be yours. How beautiful would it be if so many men listen to this and we're like, we're going to move now before it's too late, and find freedom in our lives and our relationships and what that means for your kids and their future and the family impacts. And it's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the reality is that, I mean, we've seen that's a staggering statistic, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, 98%, that don't get help until.
And by the way, I've seen that played out. I mean, I can maybe think of one or two in my whole life, friends in professional world that have really decided to, like, I've got to go do whatever it takes to get help, until they're kind of forced into it by some kind of, tough situation, some boundary, something or other. And it is a staggering statistic, and it's sad, but I definitely saw it play out in my life. I mean, I'm one of the, I'm part of the statistic for sure.
Yeah. Well, and you just think about, like, my mind goes to leaders and just the amount of men specifically that have been in the news. I mean, mega churches, big ministries, business owners, actors, Hollywood stars, whatever, that are in the news, and that you just be like, oh, and you can shake your head and be like, what were they doing or whatever. But there's so many stories like that are not in the news every single day, and the families that are left in the wake of that.
Exactly right.
And like you said before, I love the word, freedom. That's what we're after. That's my takeaway from this time, from my time with the year. It's like freedom. That's what we're after. That's what Jesus came for, was for freedom. It's for freedom that you've been set free.
Amen.
And so, that's so good.
And I want to tell you, it's possible. I mean, it's possible. I talked to so many guys who are like, they begin to find freedom and do this process the right way and get some help and get some accountability and do some digging at like why, and say like, I never thought it was possible. Like I haven't gone days or weeks. I've heard people say without pornography in my life, I never thought that like years was a thing. And I'm here to tell you that you can find freedom. And I'm one of the statistics that I've blown up my life with it, but I can sit here and tell you that I've also found freedom.
And that's one of the biggest lies. And there's a lot of lies that the enemy wants to tell us when it comes to this topic.
Yeah.
One of the biggest lies is you can't be free.
That's right.
There is no freedom for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe for Nate, but not for you.
Yeah.
And is freedom really necessary?
Yeah. And how might that, if we were able to find that freedom, how might that change our worship, our ability to parent, our ability to be husbands? Because we're operating out of a place of being able to receive love and find that freedom of like that's who God did not intend us. We talked about it to be in bondage. And yet my heart's so burdened on this topic because I just see the bondage that's everywhere. And I just wonder what would happen. And I wonder for the guy that's listening, what thoughts are sparking in his mind of like, I'm able to find that freedom. What would that mean for me?
Yeah. What would that mean? That's a good question. So the church, you mentioned that, you grew up in a church, dad is a pastor. I'm going to ask you a question about that in a second as well. But, what can churches do better? Because it still is a little bit of kind of a taboo topic a little bit that a lot of churches are uncomfortable talking about. And because there is so much shame, and you already mentioned, I think it was in the last podcast that you mentioned, Ted Cunningham, whom, I've partnered with on a number of occasions here and for ministry, and he was an episode of the podcast, but, he talks even about like sometimes it seems like that's the immediate response from guys a lot of times is like, oh, they're going to talk to us about porn. It's like the number one topic that we talk about with men, or that's the way they feel. They feel about the topic. Yeah. But the truth is we don't talk about it enough, because there are other things. There are other things vying for control of our lives other than porn. But how can the church do a better job in this area?
Yeah, we can talk about it. Let's talk about it and normalize it. I mean, we've heard the statistics. They're everywhere. And yet we don't treat it the same way, I think, in our response to it. And I get it. I mean, I just look at my own life, right?
Sure.
If I would have stayed in bondage, I would have never been able to truly, authentically help others or even talk about the topic because, again, the enemy's voice is in our head. And I think, no blame on pastors or anything, but just the church holistically has not done a good job in the past about talking about this. And I think the enemy's used that to cast more shame because it's not talked about. And again, it's like, well, nobody's really talking about this yet. It's dominating my life, right? What does that say about me? And it doesn't. So, I mean, I think the first thing is just talk about it. I'm really proud of our local church here, right? We attend the same church and a few years ago, we started having more conversations about it. And, we launched porn and pancakes. And I remember there were some thoughts on both sides about that. Like, do we really want to have a porn and pancakes event? But it's like, you know what, let's start normalizing it. Some awesome resources out there. Our church has launched some of the Pure Desire stuff around the Conqueror series and the 7 Pillars of Freedom and some like really good things that I'm now seeing over years in our church. Guys go through it, get healthy, lead more groups. Guys go through it. We're starting to see that momentum happen in churches because we're willing to talk about it. And we need vulnerability around this topic. We need people to stand up and say, you know what, I don't have it all together in this topic. That's why we need the Lord. That's why we need the Lord. But I'm willing to, with you, partner, and let's figure out how we can be more like Christ. And I think I'd love to see more of that in the church, but I get it's hard and it's a tough, shameful topic,
Well, and what would you say to a person though that says, "Yeah, okay, that sounds great, Nate. I'd love to do that. I want to go to a porn and pancakes breakfast. I want to go to a Pure Desire men's group or whatever," but they're fearful of not maybe their wife doesn't understand, or the last episode we talked about just the hurt that Maggie felt, and when she first discovered, found you looking at pornography or whatever, and so guys are like, well, I don't want to hurt my wife, but then at the same time, what if she's not understanding?
Yeah.
And there's a fear there of, what if she leaves? What if, what will my kids think of me? What will, those types of things.
Yeah. And there's a really tough reality to that question, and I don't want to oversimplify it by saying that, the sin that the Bible speaks of that we may have allowed to grab hold of our lives does have some consequences. I mean, I don't want to just brush it off and be like, that will never happen, because there are really hard consequences.
Mm-hmm.
But yet I want to give hope, because there's a ton of amazing resources. And if you haven't listened to my story, I mean, use my story as hope for your story, right? Because you name it, I found myself in the middle of it, and something that I thought there was no hope from recovering. And I know that's not a typical story, but that is absolutely, I think, a fear and a lie the enemy uses to keep us from moving forward. But again, we talked about it. If we're unable to really get it into the light, are you only going to create more consequences and hurt down the road? That's a lie we tell ourselves. Like, I got to keep this part hidden because the hurt, but then by doing that, we're only creating more hurt. And so there's hope. And
the other reality is that a lot of times we're only seeing this life.
That's right.
Right. And the reality is that we're all going to stand before the Lord naked.
Yeah.
By ourselves, without our wives, without our kids, give an account for our lives. And the Lord so desperately wants us to be able to live free here, be able to stand free before him.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm reminded, his power is made perfect in our weakness. Yeah. And so there's some weakness and some vulnerability around some of those things that you talked about, taking a first step, having a tough conversation with family, maybe. And by the way, I wouldn't recommend right now, this second, just being like, let me go tell everything to maybe a spouse as a first step, right? Need to get there. That needs to happen. There can be some very detrimental things about that, that you can actually cause more pain and hurt. And so, again, resources, start taking some steps. That will absolutely be a part of the journey, and should be if there's a journey toward true intimacy and finding that. But, just, again, take a step today and let the Lord's grace carry you through that next step.
Yeah. That's good. Okay, I want to talk about just a couple more things, and then we'll give you an opportunity to give a last word to end our time here together. But you mentioned that you're a pastor's kid, and that you kind of felt this need, and I don't know if it was put on by within your family or whatever, but this need to fit in perfectly to the church and to like, for lack of better words, perform or so. What encouragement would you give to pastors on that end, just as being a pastor's kid and just knowing the pressure that you felt? My kids are pastors' kids, and so like, talk to me too, at this time. But I feel like just growing up in that environment, and then I know that your dad had passed, obviously, prior to a lot of this happening in coming out in your life, and then but what's some encouragement that you just give to some pastors in just being dads and parents to their kids?
It's a loaded question for sure, and that was my reality. And again, I had parents who loved me really well, and and that wasn't an explicit message in our house, by the way, of like, you have to have it all together or else. That's definitely an explicit message in a lot of houses.
Sure.
But I think it was more implied. It was just like, you just got to have it. And part of the reason I think it was implied is because we didn't talk about the hard things. And so I think to carry that thought through to what advice I would give churches or pastors, to the best of your ability, give the gift of going second, and the more that we can be vulnerable, the more that you can be vulnerable around this topic, the more that you can share the message of like, we don't have to have it all together. That's flawed gospel, right? To be like, the better we do, right? That's flawed. That's not the gospel that I believe, at least. And so, give the gift of going second. Try to share vulnerably. If you don't have it all together, again, that's beautiful, and the Lord's power is able to show up there. And then just maybe create spaces to tell the church and to tell families and kids and youth that there's no expectation for them to have it all together. Nobody's perfect. Everyone sins. We all sin differently. We all sin in different ways, but we all sin. And so let's just break the pressure of just like, we're coming to this conversation as guys who can't get it right, and we're going to struggle, but that's okay. Let's struggle well. Let's struggle together. And let's lean on the Lord for those struggles, but let's be talking about them while we do it. So it's not this thing we're trying to do on our own. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where my mind goes.
No, that's good. That's good. Well, Nate, this has been good. This has been really good. I so appreciated just yours and Maggie's vulnerability in the previous episode we recorded and released. And again, if you have not listened to that episode or viewed that, I can't encourage you enough to go back and listen to that, and so that you can just know this amazing story that took a lot of work, and that is and it's work that you continue to lean in every day. Because it's not,
every day.
Yeah.
This is an everyday challenge, struggle, battle. This isn't like a once and done conversation.
Yeah.
And if it is, that's a problem, right? Because to our points, we got to keep talking about it.
But freedom is possible. And that came out through the conversation that we had in the previous episode with you and Maggie. It came out multiple times here. And, one of the greatest things is, 9 years, 10 years later, after just all of the garbage that you had to go through.
It's a nice word for it. Appreciate that.
and all the work and the tireless energy you put into it, you could say that it's not a stronghold in your life anymore.
Yeah, right. I found freedom.
You found freedom for that. And then that allows you now to be fully known by Jesus, by your wife, by your kids, and by so many others who you're encouraging. So thank you so much for the way that you are allowing God to use you because of your openness and your vulnerability, and just your willingness to not just sit on this, but to say, this is the platform that now God can use for his glory. And so thanks, you for being willing to do that.
A lot of people showed grace to me in my journey to allow me to get here, and I'm forever grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, we're here at the end of our time together, so I love to give our guests just 30 to 60 seconds of just a final word, a final encouragement or challenge, whatever it is that you want to give to the listeners today, and just whatever the Lord lays on your heart. And I'm trusting that as you do that someone's listening and is going to need this exact word from you here as your final word of listening today.
Yeah. I think what's really resonating through our discussion today is just, if you're a guy or anybody listening to this, don't believe the lie that you've got to have it all together. There's just so much strength and power as men. It shows so much strength to step out and say, yeah, I've got areas where I struggle. And that is such a powerful statement. That's leadership. That is what we want to teach our kids, right? They don't have to have it all together. And so that's kind of what resonates and comes through to me is just, I want to share, be vulnerable, take a step, even if it's a hard one. There's actually strength in admitting that you may be weak in this area. There's so much strength in that, and strength that a lot of guys will never get to. And there is such hope and freedom on the other side of this battle.
Yeah. And as you mentioned earlier, things continue to grow in the dark.
That's right.
And as we bring things to the light, freedom can take place.
Yeah.
So, Nate, my friend, I appreciate you. I love you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of RESGEN's Giving Life Podcast. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Nate Blaylock today. My prayer is that you found it helpful and that it encouraged you to live in the light and the freedom that comes along with that. If you did, I can't encourage you enough to share this episode with others who would benefit from it as well. I also pray that if our conversation today has led you to the point of realizing that you need to share your struggle with pornography with another person or a counselor, that you will follow through on doing so. You can connect more with Nate and his wife Maggie at knowncounselingservices.com. I know it will be hard to do, but I'm trusting that the Lord will give you the strength you need to do so. Well, that's all for today, friends. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you next time on RESGEN's Giving Life Podcast. Until then, continue being men whose life in Christ gives life to others. We'll see ya.